Thanks. Thank you, Chantal. Can you all hear me? Okay, and thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about this. You can probably imagine that the work of writing books is sometimes rather solitary. So to have an audience that's interested in what I have to say means a lot. Thinking about the theme of next for the Humanities month that you celebrate here, as well as in connection to Tucson Modernism Week, I do think the topic of women in this movement, that's what I'll talk to you about tonight. But I just wanted to sort of put the buzz in your ear or have you think about also how we think about innovators and creative people today. A student of mine sent me last month a link to an article in Art News on how museums have been touting how much they're doing for women artists, when in fact, statistics show that acquisitions of work by women have remained steady in the past decade at 11%. Exhibitions fare slightly better, 14%. And a recent article out of Yale, it was a study at the Yale School of Art, looked at students once graduation rates reached parity between men and women, who was being profiled in the news and in the media were men. They were 2 to 3 more times likely to appear in media representations. And lastly, I'll just say I found this quite telling because I think it's easy to sort of blame institutions or blame the media, but I also try to look at myself, and I think we can all do that a bit. I am certainly not blameless. There was a study by Oxford University in which the researchers had computers create art. And then they put up a show of the art and they put male-sounding names or female-sounding names with the art and asked the audience what they thought of it. And audience members with the women were much more likely to find the ones with the female-named art less compelling. So, I think when we think about art history suffers from this, I think particularly acutely because there is so much money in contemporary art. And the only way that we can have a creative person stand up to that is if we put them on a pedestal so high that, no real person can achieve that. So we create these geniuses, and I think the way our culture tends to work, men fit into that more. So, I'd encourage you to sort of push back on your friends or just look for the women in culture because they're doing cool stuff. And that is the topic I would like to speak to you about today. So the Bauhaus is remembered as the 20th century's most influential art institution. It was an art school, first and foremost, so it's complicated. Surrealism, for example, or Cubism were art movements. The Bauhaus is a movement, but it's also a school. There were 1,253 people there, something that might surprise a lot of people, especially because it tends to be remembered for what I like to call 5 guys. So there's Marcel Breuer. I'm showing you his chair there. It's actually in this wonderful exhibition, which I hope you will see if you haven't yet, that was curated by graduate student Moira Rydell. She did a really fantastic job. And I just want to say also that when I talk about general representations of the Bauhaus and how they tend not to include women, this show is really an exception. So in this room, right in front of you, are works by Annie Alpers, just as works by her husband, Joseph Alpers, are behind you. And that continues throughout the museum. There's good representation of women. Okay, so the Bauhaus existed from 1919 to 1933, not coincidentally the same years as the Weimar Republic, which was Germany's first democracy, bookended on the one side by World War I and on the other by the rise of Nazism. And it parallels a lot of the same experiments that were going on in Germany at that time, more broadly in culture. It existed in 3 locations, initially in Weimar by uniting a school of arts and crafts together with a school of fine art. And then once it was chased out of town because they thought it was too crazy, excuse me, it moved on to Decile, and I show you the Decile Bauhaus building there on your top left. It's still standing today. This was a purpose-built school for the Bauhaus, full of workshops, and students would initially be in a preliminary course, which was kind of the signature pedagogical innovation of the Bauhaus. And students were taught generally not to copy the masters or to learn one particular technique, but to become thinkers. So it changed over time, but often they would do things like start off with some movement exercises or think about what rain really feels like before you draw rain, or those kinds of things. Much more thought experiments than just making something beautiful. In fact, a lot of what they made looked ugly because they'd pick up trash and make a collage out of it because they were thinking about materials and what they feel like. So those are some things from the art school that might not sound unfamiliar to you or might sound familiar to you if you have studied art. And that's because the preliminary course, along with the Bauhaus members who leave Germany in 1933 and during the Nazi period, go around the world. And a lot of them came to the US. So they taught the Alpers in this room, both taught at Black Mountain College. Joseph Alpers also taught at Yale. Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus and its originator and first director, he taught at Harvard and also was a practicing architect. And László Moholy-Nagy founded the new Bauhaus in Chicago. Additionally, there were a lot of women who came here. So Pond Farm was founded, or a Bauhaus woman taught there for a number of years, who was a great ceramicist named Margarete Friedlander. The Bauhaus, if we think about how it's remembered, I would say that there's a number of things that are kind of misunderstood about it. It's often thought of as an architecture movement. All three of its directors were architects, but architecture wasn't actually taught directly in the school until 1927. They did some collaborative architecture projects, but it was actually outside of the school. And it's also remembered for these five guys particularly. And in fact, women were very important to the institution. So this image that I show you here is by one of four of the artists that I'll go on to profile for you this afternoon. This is Mahayana Blonde's tea extract pot. So it's quite tiny, it's about 4 inches across, and you would have very strong tea in there and mix it with hot water. With the prices it fetches now, you probably wouldn't do that. So this actually is a work that I think makes the case for Bauhaus women being more central to the institution than they actually are. This piece holds the current record for the highest price ever paid at auction for a Bauhaus object. So excluding painting, but for objects, this is the highest price ever paid. It was $361,000. Set in 2007. I think something could beat the record soon, but it could be another work by her because she was very good. It's been called Bauhaus in a nutshell for its perfect encapsulation of principles of modern design. It's really feted, but yet often her name even is left out of survey textbooks. So the fact that women have been relegated to the margins of Bauhaus history is consistent with the institution at its time in some ways. It began auspiciously in 1919. Walter Gropius wrote a document often referred to as the Bauhaus Manifesto, where he talks about the ideals of the school and how he really wants to create something new. It's quite inspiring. And he also said, it's kind of dated language, he said he wanted there to be no distinction between the fair and the strong sex. It always makes me laugh because it's like, oh, Grandpa, I know you were trying not to be sexist. But he really, initially they just took students on their merits. And in fact, in the first class of students, it was 52% women. And the masters, I think, rather than necessarily being bad people, were concerned about the reputation of the school. We take it for granted that this is a famous institution. At the time, they were interested in actually it surviving during many depressions, financial depressions, and a lot of cultural turmoil. So the masters met and secretly, and actually in a move that was against the law because women had the right to vote in Germany and they were guaranteed parity to their male counterparts, they said, they decided to make it harder for women to get into the Bauhaus. The records in the minutes of the Masters Council meeting from February 1920, so still within the first year of the school's existence. It started in April of 1919. This is what the secretary wrote down. In order to fill the first few places in the workshop with the most qualified, Gropius recommends proceeding as strictly as possible with the acceptances, and above all, to ensure that the female element gradually takes up no more than 1/3 of the spots. So basically they're saying, because we want excellence, we will keep the women out. They didn't completely keep them out, they just reduced the numbers. And also we can say that basically women had higher admission standards for getting in, and it fostered really an extraordinary generation of creative women. History hasn't always been as kind to them, and that's part of what my project is in talking to you about them. So women were in all of the workshops, in fact. They are often remembered for having been pushed into weaving. The second, in this graph, this was created by some colleagues of mine, Patrick Rossler, who I've done a lot of work with, and Anka Blum. The second to the lowest bar on the chart is the weaving workshop, and black represents women in a workshop. So you can see that was by far where the most women went. But it's actually just over 1/4 of all women who were at the school, because women were in every single workshop and program that the Bauhaus offered. It was not always easy, as I'll be telling you in some detail, but they were there and they were contributing. These are just some of the projects I've been doing, and I show you this because the work I'm speaking about draws is out of a chapter of Haunted Bauhaus, the work I'm speaking about this evening, but kind of behind me is all of these collaborative projects that really I didn't do on my own. So the book on the left is a collection of 14 essays that look at gender and sexuality at the Bauhaus, and on the right is this book of Bauhaus women that I co-authored with Patrick Rossler, and it looks at 45 women of the Bauhaus and kind of what they did and why they're important, and often the adversity that they faced. I co-curated an exhibition with 3 other scholars in Germany called For Bauhaus Mädels. Mädel is like a rather dated word in German. I translate it as gal, like it just sounds really kind of old-fashioned. So it's, but this was a quote from the time, because Bauhaus women were important in marketing the school, and there was an article in 1928 that said, oh, the wonderful Bauhaus Mädels are, pepping up the school. So we took this and put it in quotation marks as a way of thinking about what 4 specific Bauhaus women did. And on the right, you can see the installation of the show. And I'll be talking about 2 of the women. So if you look at the book cover, the top left and the top right one, the blue one is Gertrude Arndt, and the red one is Mahayana Blonde. There'll be some that I'm speaking about. The lower left is a ceramicist whose work I think right now is just being acquired by MoMA, but we'll have to see. And I just wanted to mention that by far I'm not the only one saying let's put more Bauhaus women into the picture. So this is a crosswalk that was created by a contemporary artist and installed on the street outside of the Design Museum. I really like it. You can see in yellow the numbers of the names of specific Bauhaus female artists. So Annie Alpers is there, Marianne Brandt is there, a number of them. But I also worry about them getting driven over. I think we should not do that. So, but it's a good thing, and it's right by the Design Museum in London, apparently, if you get a chance to go. Okay, so let me turn now to focus particularly on 4 artists for this evening. I'll talk about design and photography in particular, and why I think their work matters, and also why I think it gives us a very different look at the institution and why it matters. I'd also like to just note very briefly that one of the kind of funny challenges when you're working on women artists is their names change all the time. So this artist that I'll speak to you about first, I call her Ray Suppot. When she went into the Bauhaus, she was named Meta Erna Niemeyer. So it has nothing to do with Ray Suppot. She then, along the way, she was friends with the Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, who gave her the nickname Ray, so Ray became her first name. Then she married Hans Richter, so she was Ray Richter. Then she just wanted her own name and to do journalism. I think she was a little sick of him. So she became Renata Green in publications, and eventually she married the surrealist poet and journalist Philippe Soupeau and became Ray Soupeau. So that was the name she had longest in her adult life. I use it for efficacy, but it could be a factor also in them being less known, because if you want to see if they're in a book, if you look in the index, you have to know the 5 places you should look to find them. Okay, so in her essay that she published in the influential Werkbund journal called Die Form in 1930, this is what Renata Richter Green, also known as Ray Soupeau, said. She said, "A dress is not there for its own sake, but to be worn. Today, 90% of all women work, and these 90% need rational clothing. Life is in perpetual motion. Preferences for line, color, and attitude change, and these penchants also differ for each person. It must be a matter of fulfilling the specific demands of a dress's utility. This is the central problem of today's fashion for the 90% of women." Richter Green's solution to these demands was what she drew here, and that was published alongside her text, the transformation dress, a simple, beautifully cut, sleeveless sheath that could be combined with a minimal number of elements to fit any occasion that the modern woman might encounter. For work, wear it alone if it's hot, or add a belt and a sweater if it's cold. To change up the look, switch these out with a jacket, tie, and gloves. There actually was something called the ladies' tie. I have one, but I haven't worn it yet. So you could wear a tie, gloves, and have a matching clutch. And if you want to go from work directly to a formal evening event, no need to go home and change. You just simply button a long skirt over that dress and add some jewelry and a little cape, and you're good to go. She later recalled, "I always started with a concrete idea, a secretary or a saleswoman who wants to go out in the evening after work, but can't go home beforehand. She transforms her dress." She added, "The main requirement were first-class fabric that would stand up to all the stresses and the cut." And she also recalled she was always looking at the price. A lot of these women were working, but they weren't making that much money, and that mattered to her too. So Ray Soupeau was a designer, but she was also a journalist, filmmaker, and photographer. With her transformation dress, she reimagined female coded clothing to match the unfolding life of the new women who were living lives like she did. They were dynamic, modern, and they called for adaptation and the need sometimes to travel light. Affordability was important, and she was interested in creating things that could allow a woman to work and go out, but even to travel. So she created another version of this dress that had sporty shorts, kind of a culotte kind of thing, and someone could go directly from work to the train station and go away for the weekend. I like to imagine that if you were hiking, maybe you brought another dress too, because you might get a little smelly, but didn't show up in photographs. Okay, so as with her fashion design, Ray Soupeau's life underwent a lot of transformation. After 2 years at the Bauhaus from 1921 to 23, she moved to Berlin and remained officially a member of the Bauhaus and participated in the 1923 large exhibition that the school had, which is the first time they're really presenting themselves to the public. She was a weaver at the Bauhaus, but it was among Bauhaus friends in the 20s in Berlin that she learned to become a filmmaker initially. She collaborated with two of the now best-known avant-garde filmmakers of the 20s, Viking Engeling, I just show you snippets of his Diagonal Symphony. You can watch it on YouTube if you're interested. It's an abstract film. It's really, when I show it to students, they think like, oh, that's so boring. And I say, just imagine if you didn't have already a fixed idea of what a film should be. Then it's kind of exciting to think how do we make lines and shapes disappear and appear? It's kind of psychedelic. I don't tell them that though, because who knows what they'd go and do. She also, she helped Viking Engeling complete the film before his death in 1924. And she shot films of Hans Richter's film study. I just show you a snippet of that on the right. And she also married Hans Richter, who is himself remembered as an avant-garde filmmaker. She's often not credited, but she shot portions of that and worked with him on the film. She knew other members of the avant-garde. I mentioned Kurt Schwitters, the Dadaist, but also filmmakers and painters like Fernand Léger, Man Ray, and Sergei Eisenstein. Her second husband, Philippe Soupeau, was initially, he was one of the first signers of the Surrealist Manifesto, but he became interested in journalism, and the two of them started traveling the world together, and she photographed Parisian street life, architecture in rural villages in Norway, Spain on the brink of civil war. And these often then were the illustrations for her husband's newspaper articles. The two of them went to Tunisia once France fell and became the Vichy regime, a fascist arm of Nazi Germany. And the two of them lived for a long time a number of years in North Africa. And it was during that time that she made the series that included this image. She was accompanied by a Tunisian police escort into a part of Tunis that was called the Reserved Quarter, or the Quartier Réservé, which was a walled and locked neighborhood of female outcasts, some of whom lived by prostitution, but many of them just were simply destitute and lived on what charity they could get. In the space of 2 days, she took a very extraordinary series of photographs that are remarkable, I think, for their empathy and their intimacy. So they're really not, documenting them in a cold way, but in a very intimate sort of way. When Philippe and Ray Soupeau fled, advancing Italian and German fascist forces in 1942 by hitching a ride on one of the last buses out of Tunis to the Algerian border, Ray Soupeau had to travel light. They simply boarded the bus with no possessions at all. This meant she had to leave her archive of thousands of negatives and her camera, because having a camera with her would have meant that she would have been shot on spot if she'd been apprehended by fascist authorities. They were effectively stateless for the next years, and they had no money to buy her a new camera. They traveled through the Americas because Philippe especially was working with the French Committee for National Liberation, which was a provisional government in exile headed by Charles de Gaulle. And Philippe Soupeau was trying to create an alternative news agency and network for them. During this time, Ray Soupeau again used a found technology to make a fairly daring self-portrait, which was taken in an amusement park in Buenos Aires in 1944, and I show it to you here. You can see in the background some of her expat friends, the photographer Giselle Freund and screenwriter Jacques Remy. They seem to be distracted, right, looking off at something else going on in the fair. Ray Soupeau in the foreground, looking out towards us, looks pretty glamorous, I think. I'm once tempted to wonder if that isn't some kind of transformable getup she has on. Her attention appears kind of locked outwards and on the viewer. But if we look closer, we can see, she has some kind of apparatus in front of her. And it's not a camera, although that was a common trope for female photographers at the time, to photograph themselves in a mirror, for example. So you see them with the camera on their face, or if it's a Rolleiflex, it's beneath them. In fact, what she's got in front of her face is a gun that's trained on all of us. And that's because this image is not one of violence, but it's her actually mastering a new technology. This was a kind of element in the amusement park that if one shot a bullseye with the air gun, then one got a photograph taken instantly, and that was the prize. So that's how she made this photograph, even though she had no camera, no money, was stateless, and had to leave all her photographic negatives thousands of miles away. So I see her as kind of epitomizing this drive to explore new ways of living and being that was the spirit of Bauhaus New Womanhood. She's also representative of the fact that a lot of these Bauhaus artists, Bauhaus women, but all Bauhaus artists are really trained to adapt and to change what they're doing constantly. So with that, I want to move to the second case that I'll be telling you about, and that's Friedel Dicker, who also was in the early Bauhaus. She came with the influential teacher Johannes Itten, who was the founder of the preliminary course. I can tell you about it more in the Q&A if you like, but he was a believer in an experimental religion called Mazdaznan that most of the students he brought with him also believed in, and it became central to the early Bauhaus. It was a mishmash of Zoroastrianism and kind of you have it. It was basically a new age religion for the time. And Friedel Dicker was influenced by this, among other things. But she was really also distinguished among her classmates for how good of an artist she was, how adaptable she was. So she went into the bookbinding workshop, but she was doing street theater with puppets of her own design. She was making costume designs. She, along with another Bauhaus student, a friend of hers, she signed off. They were the first students to create a flat-roofed building, which was just in a design form, but this was one of the signatures, would become kind of a signature Bauhaus architecture design trope. So she really kind of could do anything. And because she was so adaptable, and also because she came from a poor family, the masters picked her as the first student that they had train other students. Throughout his life, Johannes Itten, this great teacher at the Bauhaus, he published a number of books on his pedagogical methods, and he almost always included a reproduction of this work because he considered her one of his best students. Together with Franz Singer, her collaborator and fellow Bauhaus student, they made this toy set called, this didn't advance, there we go, called Fantasius. And it's basically Lego about more than 20 years before Lego actually happens. Lego's a post-war design phenomenon. And so children would get these different wooden forms, and just like Lego, I have a child, so I know there are different approaches to Legos. And some kids really want to follow the directions and make exactly what's in the picture. And so there were directions, and you could make the pelican, you can see on the right there, or the turtle. There was also seal and train and other things you could make with the little booklet. Or you could just mess around and make stuff. So it's really a lot like Lego before the fact. And it's kind of, I like it because it's functional and convertible, which is true of a lot of their design. So, here we go. Singer and Dicker together had then a design studio in Vienna, and they specialized often in transformable interior designs. So the exteriors looked very modernist, and the interiors were rather luxurious. This was actually for a guest house owned by a countess just in the back property in the middle of Vienna. It sadly doesn't survive. But there were two large guest suites, and this is just an image of one of them. So the upper part by day, you could have kind of a comfortable receiving area, hang out. There are a lot of cactuses on the left. So cactuses were very big in the 20s. I don't know why. Maybe they got them from this region. But at night, you could retract the stairs and roll out this double bed. You could have left your reading material on the nightstand. Everything's all there and ready for you. And other elements transform then into sleeping quarters. In 1929, there was, of course, the global stock market crash that originates in New York, goes around the world, and really starts to hit Europe in early 1930. And this causes a lot of the political ideas and experiments that have been going on in Europe to become sharpened to the extreme. So it's really a debate between communism and fascism. And I think looking back, I certainly think communism is a much happier, friendlier approach, even though it was maligned a lot in the 50s and 60s, and certainly the forms of communism that we've had have had massive problems as well. But fascism is, of course, as we all know, the way that Europe went, and there were disastrous and horrible results. So in 1931, Friedel Dicker decides to stop working so much as an architect and artist and to dedicate herself much more to activism. She becomes a member of the Communist Party. She'd already been in the Montessori movement and done design for Montessori schools, and a lot of those people were communists, and through those circles she becomes radicalized. So I show you here a photograph of a photo montage that she did, and she did a number of these, and they're quite dramatic. So in the center you can see a worker, and at his waist is his pleading child who's starving. And the whole of the montage contains a lot of text, and it really decries the fact that Austrian society seems to have plenty of money for weapons, but not enough to feed its workers and its poor. And she has a lot of examples of that with photographic evidence. She was arrested in 1934 for her political activity and interrogated. It was a pretty difficult experience, I think, and it was actually Singer who got her out of jail. Supposedly, she had probably, because she could do anything, she probably was forging documents to help friends get to safety, and some of these were found. And the story goes that Franz Singer was asked by the authorities, she's an artist, right? She could have done these. And he said, Friedel, she can't draw a straight line. And they believed him, and she got out. So she continued on ever eastward and ended up with, she eventually married a man named Brandeis and ended up in the eastern part of Czechoslovakia. And they were Jewish, and they both were no longer allowed to work after 1937. And eventually they were put in Theresienstadt ghetto and concentration camp. And they actually knew for a while beforehand that they were going. Of course, they didn't know the fate that awaited them. But Dicker threw herself into gathering materials for teaching because she knew there would be students there. She'd already been a teacher, and this mattered to her a lot. So she went with very little clothing, but sheets that she dyed green so that they could maybe do stage sets, and this could make a forest if they threw it over a bunch of kids, and paper and pencils. And so in Theresienstadt, this is a watercolor that she did, but she taught 500 children using largely Bauhaus methods, a form that we might call proto-art therapy. So she ended up using these techniques as something that would be much more healing. She did not survive. She, in 1944, went to Auschwitz, actually at her own insistence, because her husband had left for she didn't know where, and she said, I want to go where he is going. And he was a skilled carpenter, so he survived Auschwitz, and she was gassed the day after she got there. But about 100 of her students survived, and one of them came to the US. Her name was Erna Foreman, and she became a renowned child psychologist and used some of these techniques that come from the Bauhaus with her students. And another of her students who she'd worked with together in Vienna and Prague helped found the art therapy movement in the US. Her name was Edith Kramer. So, this I think is a really clear case of when we put the women back in, where Bauhaus pops up, yes, it's at Yale and at Harvard, but it's also in art therapy and other things that mean a lot to a lot of people, even if they maybe aren't quite as famous. Okay, the third case I'd like to talk to you about is Mahayana Blonde, the maker of this teapot, that tea extract pot that I showed you before, that's the record holder. She also was a designer of other articles in the metal workshop. The workshop was remembered as one of the most male-dominated workshops. In fact, she's the only woman to have gotten her degree from the workshop. There were 13 women who entered it, and the men would just kind of make life a little difficult for them. Mahayana Blonde remembered this later, but she didn't realize that they were doing this. She just thought everyone had to do really, really boring work all the time and that it just was endless. And she kept going, and this work actually she made during her first year at the Bauhaus, and she was recognized by them as an excellent designer, and they got along quite well. In 1927, she became what was called the Mitarbeiter, or the associate of the head of the workshop. The head was László Moholy-Nagy. You can see his works in one of his films in the next room. And so she had this official and paid position within the workshop. When Moholy-Nagy left the Bauhaus in 1928, she became the acting head of the workshop. So not only was she the only woman, but she was actually heading it. And it's at this time that she makes a really interesting series of photographs. So they're a bit difficult to decode, and I'm going to walk you through one of them and then just show you a few examples. What you can imagine, this is basically a photograph of something a little like a Christmas tree ornament, a glass ball with a metallic coating. And if you look at the top, that white line that goes to the top that's out of focus is a string, so it's hanging from somewhere. This is, I should actually have brought this slide, but the actual item, it's about this big, and it's gold, and it's in an archive in the eastern part of Germany, and I was just there kind of photographing for my records what they have, and I took a photograph of this, and then I realized, it was like my own version of this, me with my cell phone in this. So it was funny that the object still reacts in that way. You can see the artist herself in the lower right corner. Next to her is a Rolleiflex camera, and that's also quite interesting that she was using that. Those are they're not a single lens reflex or double lens reflex. It's a single lens, single mirror in it. So you look in them from the top. So to make this image, she totally couldn't see what she was doing. A lot is left to chance. But what she can see when she's looking in the reflected surface of the Christmas ornament in front of her is she can see where the lens is, right? So she can kind of get a sense of like, I'm looking at the lens and the lens is looking at me. And what the ornament then does is it bends the architecture around her and makes it kind of curvy. And this is the architecture of Walter Gropius's Decile Bauhaus building that's incredibly straight. So she's kind of performing this magic trick where she is bending the architecture. She's using metal, a metallic surface, as kind of the space in which she appears to us, and metal is her medium. So it's quite masterful. At the same time, I'd say she makes herself look quite cute, kind of elf-like and diminutive. And I think this is important because it shows up in a lot of works from this series. So this is another one she's done with fabric woven in the Bauhaus weaving workshop. And the camera is in the distance. I don't know if you can see it. I can point it out to you. I don't know if this doesn't have a pointer. It's right here. We have this series of reflective balls kind of cast around, and then her head almost appears like another ball in the series. And I think it's quite telling that in this one too, in the first one we hardly saw her body, in this one we don't really see it at all. And I would say that as she's trying to image herself as a new kind of artist, this is something a lot of people were doing right at this time. They're saying, we don't want to just make paintings for rich people. We want to kind of make something that's going to mean something for today. So while she's trying to image herself as that, she's got a bit of a body problem, that the body doesn't really quite fit. And so she hides herself in most of them. But in one, she does something very unusual, which is to show herself kind of as a traditional image of women in the history of art. So you can see this is just on your left, an extract from the larger image. But she's kind of posed, almost like a Venus figure would be, and she's dressed up. This is the only photograph I've ever seen of her dressed up. She tended to wear pants and really practical clothing. She's got on white stockings and shoes. So she's kind of posing herself in this scene as, I think of her as like a Bauhaus babe. And what's she reading? Well, she's reading the latest issue of the Bauhaus's in-house journal, Bauhaus. And coincidentally, or not coincidentally, I would say, in it is an article, the one article that she published, which was called Bauhaus Style. And it was a response to a criticism by the constructivist Noam Gabo, so a Russian constructivist who visited the Bauhaus and criticized especially her workshop as saying they're making a style. Now, this may not sound that terrible to you, but that was like the worst thing you could say to a Bauhaus person, because the idea, Bauhaus by this time in the later 20s, is really caught up with constructivism. And the idea is to make things that are exactly how they need to be to do their job. So it's a kind of, truth to materials. Materials should be worked the way they want to be worked. This was almost kind of a science to them. Kind of a made-up science, but they believed in it. And that things should be just practical. There should be no ornamentation at all. And so he says, they're making a style. And she writes back and says, we are not making a style. She writes about this, and this is what she said. Because a lot of what they were doing, I should say, I showed you an example of the lighting. Under her leadership, they designed a number of lights that went into mass production and were in production actually throughout the Weimar period, but also during the Nazi period. They weren't marked as Bauhaus, and even from that same factory in the GDR. So I have one that was made in East Germany because it was a good desk light design, and lighting is brand new for the homes of most people at this time. About something close to 50% of the population gets lighting over the course of the Weimar Republic, so people needed home lights. Okay, so they're designing these lamps, and here's her response then to Noam Gabo. She says, while we may not have invented the electric light bulb, we have nevertheless endeavored to find a proper application of its essence and, for example, to liberate it from forms like the candelabra and the gas lamp, adopted without consideration for utility. So many of her fellow designers just took whatever they had for some kind of other technology, like gas or kerosene, and just stuck a light bulb on it. And she said, we don't want to do that. We want to make really good things. So this is what she's showing here. She's showing her technological know-how within this image. And I'd just like to also frame this body problem, of her asserting herself as a designer, but at the same time showing herself as kind of a beautiful woman in relation to the ideas of one of her contemporaries. I don't think they knew each other. This was the psychoanalyst Joan Riviere. But in 1929, Joan Riviere published an essay called Womanliness as a Masquerade. And what she noted, she was a psychoanalyst, she was one of the translators of Freud, and she was a pretty high-powered intellectual woman at the time. And she saw among her female peers that they seemed to do this thing that she thought was strange, which is that basically if they had given a presentation or asserted themselves against, expressed a different opinion than male colleagues, often afterwards, they would behave incredibly, almost in a girly kind of manner, or very hyper feminine. So Joan Riviere came up, she said, why are they doing this? Not to blame them, but more to say, like, what's going on in culture that would make them do this? And she wrote, Womanliness, in Womanliness as a Masquerade, she wrote, womanliness can be assumed and worn as a mask, both to hide the possession of masculinity, by which she means power, but it's coded as masculine at the time, and to avert the reprisals expected if a woman was found to possess this masculinity, much as a thief will turn his pockets out and ask to be searched to prove that he has not stolen the goods. The reader may now ask how I define womanliness, or where I draw the line between genuine womanliness and the masquerade. My suggestion is not, however, that there is any such difference. Whether radical or superficial, they are the same thing. So in 1929, Mahayana Blonde makes this photograph, and Joan Riviere writes about this. And this is a woman leading one of the most successful workshops in the Bauhaus, and at the same time, one of her very good friends, who's her assistant, the designer Hein Bredendijk, who was a male Bauhaus designer, is saying to her, I'm really not sure you have what it takes to lead this workshop. And he writes to her one day, how is it that the Bauhaus gets to entertain you? So after a year, she stepped down from this position, I think because it was rather exhausting for her. She wanted to design more. I think she was also an introverted person, and leadership was taxing for her. But, so we have these leaders, female leaders of the Bauhaus, but they have struggles of their time that I think still resonate to a certain extent today. Okay, and then just briefly, I want to talk about a final example of a Bauhaus woman, and this is also a designer who turns to photography. So in a way, she's kind of a pair with Mahayana Blonde. Both women are working on the campus of the Decile Bauhaus, and both of them are working alone and creating, it's just them and the camera, creating very different sets of images, as I'll show you in a minute. So Gertrude Arndt was trained initially in architecture. She worked in the German city of Erfurt for an architect, did sketches for him, learned photography actually so that she could do a survey of architecture of their city. And she went to the Bauhaus hoping to become an architect, and also she took some of the courses that one would need to eventually start studying architecture. But she became a weaver, like so many of them. She was a very good weaver. She was known for her design in color, and she was kind of their crack rug maker, if there can be such a thing. I guess it takes a while, so maybe you're not a crack one, but she was really good at it. So in the Weimar Bauhaus, in the director's office on the floor here, this is an image that was hand-colored afterwards or colorized, but you can get a sense of what one of her rugs looked like, and they were really beautiful. In 1927, she completed her Bauhaus studies, and in March of that year, she went to the Guild, which was still responsible for certifying makers and creators, craftspeople in their trades. So she went to the Guild and took her journeyman's examination as a weaver. She passed, and she promised herself that day that she would never weave again because she didn't like it. So she really made a refusal of this profession that she dedicated 4 years to and that she was very good at. She married one of her classmates who was named Alfred Arndt, so her original last name was Hanschk, and they moved away so that he could become an architect. They returned to the Bauhaus in 1929 because he was hired as a junior master to teach there. And she did not return to the weaving workshop. She could have gone back in and started helping right away. And instead, she lived in one of the master's houses designed by Walter Gropius on the campus. This could have been maybe a luxury to just relax a little bit, but she felt that she'd become what she called a do-nothing. And out of what she referred to as pure boredom, she started taking photographs. Some of them were of her friend Otto Berger. Yeah, they're pretty good, right? I know, this is the Bauhaus everyone should know, I think. But they were mostly self-portraits. What she did is just alone in this master's house, she set up veils, fabric, remember, this is a weaver, right? And she had a broom handle that she put a little picture on of some kind, and then she'd go around the camera and focus on that and then go back in and put herself in. And she then jerry-rigged something so she could pull the shutter release herself. She didn't have a proper release. And she took these photographs. I think these are really interesting because, she transforms herself, right, with makeup, veils, hats, and these weird facial expressions. In this one, she looks almost like she's sort of astonished to have this fabric right in front of her. Also a rejection maybe of her medium. And I think they're also really interesting because everything I've been telling you about the Bauhaus is how it's thinking about, kind of going along the theme of this. What's next? What's the future of the Bauhaus? And she kind of shuts that down and refuses to be so future-oriented. The images have a sense of the historical and the old-fashioned. Some of the objects were from the costume box of her friend Otto Berger. Some of them were, probably found at junk shops. So there's almost a Victorian thing going on in some of them, but it's not any serious interest in the past. It's just kind of, this layering. All of the portraits are also numbered, but the numbers are meaningless. They are not consecutive. They're just random numbers she put on them at some point. So it's this constant, refusal to play along or to really go anywhere. She didn't show them to many people at the time. She showed them to her husband, her friend Otto Berger, the weaver, and her friend Jost Schmidt. And when he saw this one, actually, he said, "You look like a whore." So I think she was sort of deterred from showing them for a while. They reappeared in the 1970s, coincidentally just about a few years before the other photographs I showed you by Mahayana Blonde. So some of it is that these women didn't necessarily promote all their work, and just, someone happened to ask them about it and they'd say, oh, well, I have these photographs. So I'd just like to say then, in conclusion, that I think these mask portraits are a really important contrast to the other projects of the Bauhaus, which are aimed at moving forward and creating a better future. And I think it's wonderful to kind of contemplate this artist's creative unbecoming. She did go on to have a very rich life. She had a number of children, and I'm pretty sure she secretly was helping her husband in his architecture practice the whole time. A lot of great architects are astonishingly productive and have wives who actually are trained architects too, so I think it's probably a case of that. But we won't know because she didn't necessarily say anything about that. The queer theorist Jack Haberstam has written about how our culture is oriented towards futurity and emphasized that failure is an option. He writes, "What kinds of reward can failure offer us? Failure allows us to escape the punishing norms that discipline behavior and manage human development with the goal of delivering us from unruly childhoods to orderly and predictable adulthoods. Failure preserves some of the wondrous anarchy of childhood and disturbs the supposedly clean boundaries between adults and children, winners and losers." So I think art's case, even though it doesn't result in any design or any useful objects, is in a way a think experiment that asks us to think about our own future and when we need to maybe stop and reassess and move on. And overall, I just plead for all of us to think about a bigger Bauhaus and a bigger history, to reintegrate women into all of the histories we're thinking about and into the futures and the present, and not just women, to think about diversity incredibly broadly, because I think all of us have something to share and not all of us are going to shout about it. So I think with that, I'll wrap up at my alternative look at the Bauhaus and be very happy to take your questions. Thanks.